Good evening, everyone. Hi, my name is Marty Camino. I'm the executive director here at the center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you for tonight's program. We are honored to offer a diverse range of programming here at the center, and as we look forward, just today we announced the Hootenanny, which is a very popular community event each year, coming up on Monday, September 13th. So I wanted to let you know about that and hope you will join us then. I also want to let you know that Old Bill's giving season is upon us. And here at the center, we are a nonprofit, and we depend on the generosity of our community to keep our doors open and be able to offer programs such as the one we have tonight. So thank you in advance for keeping us in mind and remembering us during Old Bills. I also want to take an opportunity to say thank you to Dakota Russell and the team at the Hart Mountain Wyoming Foundation. We are presenting this program tonight in partnership, and it's been great to work with them, so thank you. Tonight, we feature Shirley Higuchi, author of Setsukos Secret, Hart Mountain and the Legacy of the Japanese American Incarceration. Shirley is also the chair of the Hart Mountain Wyoming Foundation, and this story uncovers her family's past and embarks on a transformational journey as she learns about the Japanese American incarceration during World War II and what happened to her family and those of other former incarcerees. So tonight we start with a short film, and once again I want to say thank you for being here.
I always knew that my parents met as children at a place called Hart Mountain in Wyoming. And my mother, Setsuko, always called it a place of love. It was only after she died, however, that I learned the truth. Hart Mountain was a prison. 14,000 Japanese Americans were incarcerated there during World War II for the crime of looking like the enemy. Setsukos Secret is my attempt to understand the lives of my family, myself, in the complicated history of the Japanese American experience. Both sets of my grandparents immigrated from Japan. The Higuchis came first, arriving in 1915 from Saga, on the southern island of Kyushu. They started farming in Santa Clara County, California. My mother's parents, the Saitos, came in 1918 and in 1923. They lived in San Francisco's Japantown and opened a store. Life in California was hard for Japanese Americans. State law banned immigrants from owning land, and Caucasian neighbors often resented their success. The children of immigrants called the Nisei had to work extra hard to prove they were loyal Americans. Despite hardships, many Japanese Americans found the good life and made their way in society. Some became professionals and owned their own home, and others excelled in college. But then came December 7th, 1941. After Pearl Harbor, wartime hysteria and racism intensified towards Japanese immigrants and Japanese American citizens. They called them spies or saboteurs, despite the lack of evidence. Then on February 19, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which allowed the military to ban Japanese Americans from the West Coast. Census records told the government where to find Japanese Americans. Signs posted in neighborhoods said they had just days to pack and leave. They could only bring what they could carry. my family was issued a duffel bag with their name and number stenciled on the outside. Shikata ganai, some said, the Japanese term for it can't be helped. There was little resistance. They were first sent to assembly centers, which were temporary concentration camps on converted fairgrounds and racetracks. Some families slept in horse stalls and were forced to live like animals. This lasted a few months. Then the prisoners rode on a darkened train to one of the 10 concentration camps scattered across the U.S. My father remembers peering under the window shades to see where the train was going. My family was sent to Hart Mountain Relocation Center in Wyoming. Many prisoners wept when they saw their new home surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Wind and dust swept through the tar paper walls. The barracks had no running water, the bathrooms had no privacy, and the mess hall food was terrible. Summers were sweltering and winters were brutal. The prisoners repeated another term, gaman, which means endure. In spite of this treatment, many incarcerees yearned to serve the country that imprisoned them. They enlisted in the army and fought bravely in Europe and the Pacific. But others stood up for their rights. More than 80 men at Hart Mountain resisted the military draft as long as they were prisoners. They were convicted and sent to federal prison. The rest of the Japanese American community shunned them for decades. My parents and grandparents spent 3 years behind barbed wire. After the war, they, along with many others in the community, wanted to put the shame and the rejection behind them. They never talked about it. My generation, called the Sansei, could not understand why. Only after my mother died did I realize the depth of her commitment to preserving the memory of the incarceration. She inspired me to understand this part of my family's history and my community's experience. Over the last decade, I've been committed to safeguarding against the racism and fear that drove the Japanese American incarceration. It was my mother, Setsuko, and her secret that taught me, and hopefully you, that we can never relax in the fight for justice.
Now, please help me welcome to the stage author Shirley Higuchi, Pete Simpson, and Sam Mihara.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming here this evening. And I just wanted to mention the film that you just saw was a film that was created by my cousin, and her mother was actually born at Hart Mountain. And so it's kind of nice that she was able to help capture something that her mother had experienced at Hart Mountain, too. But I hope the film sort of gave you some background in terms of what happened in 1942 at Hart Mountain. But the story of the Japanese Americans and the incarceration period is very complex. And I don't want to minimize the complexity around that. In particular, my parents' generation, the Niseis, they never really talked about their experiences. So for somebody like myself growing up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, with no Japanese Americans around me, or Asians for that matter, it probably was very, very confusing for me as an 8-year-old kid, 9-year-old kid growing up. So I really didn't know much, except for, a newspaper that, came from California from time to time. I would hear stories from my parents and relatives, but camp was always described as a fun place to be. It really wasn't a horrible place, because after all, that's where my parents met. And but for the Japanese-American incarceration, I wouldn't be here this evening talking to all of you. So you kind of have to, not get too demanding about history, because you don't know what could result from that. But my book really captures the characters in Hart Mountain, in particular two that are really well profiled. Secretary Norman Mineta, who was actually a child at Hart Mountain along with my parents and Sam, who's here tonight. And Alan K. Simpson, who's Pete's, I guess, younger brother by a couple of years. And the thing that's really a blessing about these two men is they have been there in many ways in the beginning and towards the end. They met as Boy Scouts at Hart Mountain. And the story goes that they became fast friends and they stayed in touch for many years after that in Congress, passing great laws. And Norm went on to be Secretary of Commerce and Transportation under two administrations. So we're really blessed to have the commitment of both of them. But other characters that are in the book tonight are with me tonight, and I'm so happy to be here. And one of them is Pete Simpson, who's on my board of directors. And he's a leader in education in Wyoming and former president of the University of Wyoming Foundation. He learned from his childhood the hard facts about Hart Mountain as a child, but learned to love it and is still with us today to help tell that story. So thanks, Pete, for being here. And then I have Sam Mihara to my right, who was a child incarceree at the time. And he knew my mother before and during after the war, which came as a shock to me because after 2011 and we had our grand opening, Sam showed up in my office in Washington, D.C., and he said he wanted to help. He wanted to make a difference. His experience scarred him in many ways, but he grew to love the foundation and our museum after the grand opening, and now he travels around the country telling his story and raising money for our foundation. But he also had a terrible experience because his father went blind in the camp, and he'll talk about that a little bit, and his grandfather unfortunately passed away of cancer in the camp. Another guest here tonight that'll join the stage later is Doug Nelson. He was a 1968 graduate student at the University of Wyoming, and he was the first historian to write a book on Hart Mountain, really digging into the resistors, which is a group that resisted the draft because they were incarcerated at Hart Mountain. He also led the Annie E. Casey Foundation as its CEO. He led the CDC Foundation, and he is now a Carter Center trustee. And he is now leading the Simpson Institute and directing our mission in that direction. And then we have Dakota Russell, our executive director. He led the Missouri State Parks programs and museums, and he upgraded and professionalized our staff. He is leading the fundraising efforts and the architectural design of our new institute. So I'm so glad they'll be joining us on the stage. But I'd like to direct the first question to Pete, if that's okay. And if you could tell us, Pete, as a boy, describe your first impressions of Hart Mountain and what that was like.
Well, first, Shirley, I want to commend you on the book. It's a wonderful book. It's colorfully told, and it has great stories in it. And also for you folks here from Jackson, this place moves to causes and to worthy events, and so it's nice to see you all. And there are several with gray hair like me. I can see them out there. Anyhow, it's wonderful to be back here and to be in this context. We grew up in Cody, Wyoming, which was 12 miles from this place, a city of 11,000 Japanese Americans by the time 1942 rolled around. In 1943, and now I'll confide my age in case you can't tell, I was 13 years old in 1943, and my brother was 12. And we were confronted with the news that there was out there a camp that Cody folks called the Jap camp, and that we had some prospects that were frightening about that. So my first impression was quizzical, but also fearful in the context of the time. Pearl Harbor was just a year and a half earlier. So when our scoutmaster, Al's and mine, who was the uncle of my wife, I married her for that reason. No, anyhow, he was a great guy. His name was Glenn Livingston. And Glenn was scoutmaster, and the Wyoming Bighorn Basin scout troops were invited by Scout Troop 333 in Hart Mountain to come out for a jamboree at the, quote, Jap camp. Well, Glenn, I'll never forget him in the basement of the old Presbyterian church saying, boys, we're going to go out to the relocation center, to a jamboree, and you better ask your parents if they'll let you go. But you, when you're asking them, tell them they salute the same flag, they swear the same oath, and they wear the same uniform. So we all went back to our homes, and only one parent decided that was not for her son. The rest of us went out there. It was a lasting, vivid experience for all of us. I'll have to confide, if you don't mind. I know you've got some other questions, but I was a little bit concerned because the first game we were to play was Blind Man's Bluff. I don't know whether anybody's ever played that in here. If you haven't, don't let the guy who's swinging the newspaper have a Los Angeles Times in his hand. It's a hell of a lot bigger than the Cody Enterprise, I'll tell you. And boy, he bloodied my nose, and of course he was kind of peeking too. You're supposed to reach him and get him. Well, it was tough to do. And I made a good friend out there named Luke Sakata. I don't know whether anyhow, Luke Sakata was, I thought he was the funniest guy I'd ever seen. We went out to catch a football in cold weather. It was chilly as the devil. It was in September. It just happened to be cold as it was in Hart Mountain. And we were throwing the football around, and Luke said, boy, it's so cold, my goose pimples got goose pimples. I thought, this guy's funnier than Bob Hope. I thought, he's terrific. And he said, why don't you come over to my shack, my block, my house. And I think my mom has hot chocolate. You couldn't cook in those barracks, but they did have a pot-bellied stove to warm the place. And I walked into that barrack, and his mother had a pot of hot chocolate on that pot-bellied stove. Never tasted any better. It was cold enough. And then he asked me if I'd like to meet his grandmother. And because you could only take what you could carry, I thought, well, I'd be happy to. And I walked into a room which was decorated with fabulous tapestries. Those were light. You could carry those. She was beautiful, sitting on a sort of oriental chair. She was a Nisei.
Nisei, okay.
And she was so gracious, gray-haired lady. And I thought, heaven's sake, what a setting this is. I was impressed by it. Let me just do a fast forward and then let you carry on, because you've got to talk with Sam too. 50, 60 years later, when we formed this foundation, when the foundation asked me to join, which I was very proud to do, we went for the opening of the Hart Mountain Interpretive Center. Please go if you have a chance. It's moving. And they had put together in the museum part the replica of a tar paper shack. So the then director, a guy by the name of Steve Leger, says, well, let's go outside, Pete, and attend the opening. And I said, well, just a minute. And I wanted to go into the shack, into the replica of the shack. And when I got to the door, it still moves me. To go in, I remember that kid, I remember that grandmother, I remember that mother and that little family. And so I've been on some boards that sometimes use you and sometimes abuse you. I've been on some that are great, some that are small, some that are inspiring. But this board I'll never stop being on, like it or not, Shirley, because this is important. This is important. So thank you for the question.
Well, I have one other follow-up question. I wanted you to talk about your father, Millward, a little bit. And during my research in the book, I found out that your father was part of the American Legion, and he came in and visited Clarence Uno, who was a World War I veteran. And we had World War I vets that were actually incarcerated at Hart Mountain. Can you talk about your dad a little bit and what that experience was like, being with your dad in the camp as a child and experiencing all that?
Well, he took us out. By the way, the name is misspelled on the signs out here. It's not 2 L's, it's 1. Anyhow, Millward. And he took us out to the camp because he had some duties as a county attorney to see if he could provide some services like hospital services, a mortuary. It was a big city, those kinds of things. And I can still remember being taken out to Hart Mountain the first time before we went as scouts. And I can recall we stayed outside and Dad went inside and did not take us. We weren't part of that game. And I can remember looking out the back of an old Ford V8 in the rear window and seeing a guard tower with a soldier in it with the guns pointed inside. And underneath the tower, talk about learning what ambiguity means. There was a soldier with a Fifth Army patch saying goodbye to his girlfriend who was going off to war, who was a Japanese American. Those are indelible queries and lessons that are hard to forget. Dad was very instrumental in helping with the needs at Hart Mountain and felt strongly about it as patriotic as he was. He was committed to helping citizens who were there incarcerated at Hart Mountain.
Well, we thank you and we thank your family for all that commitment. And look, we're still here today after all these years, still working together to support Hart Mountain in its memory. I'd like to turn to Sam Mihara next. And Sam, can you describe for the audience what it was like to be forcibly removed from your home in San Francisco and what that experience was like? And then when you eventually got, forced into Hart Mountain, what was daily living like? That came up a lot in the last couple of days when I've been talking to folks around town.
Well, thank you, Shirley, and thanks to all of you here in Wyoming. I really appreciate the opportunity to tell you a little bit about what happened and what I remember. My family came from Japan, in a western part of Japan called Matsuyama area, and my grandparents knew that it was important to break out of their economic cycle. They were common laborers, and so they had my father become well educated. He went to a really good college in Japan, majored in English of all things, and then he of course knew Japanese well. So he had no problems at all finding a job in San Francisco at a newspaper, at a bilingual newspaper, and he became very successful. He met my mother, and they got married, and as a result, I was born in San Francisco. My brother was also born, and therefore we are American citizens by birth. And that was, we were in a neat, really comfortable 3-story Victorian house in the heart of San Francisco, a beautiful house, and it was comfortable until December the 7th. Awful day. And after that, we found out that President Roosevelt signed this executive order which he simply gave the authority to remove people. He gave the authority to remove people to local military commanders. He didn't name them. He didn't say, Japanese or Germans or Italians. He simply said, I'm going to assign this authority to these military leaders. Well, who are these military? There were 5 of them in the country. There was an eastern part, there was a central part, which by the way includes Wyoming. There was a southern part, and there was a Hawaiian way out in the Pacific, and there was a Pacific western section. And these 5 generals, 4 of them said, we're not going to remove anybody. We don't have a problem. In fact, the station needed workers, so the generals did not remove them. So the people like in Wyoming, there were some in Riverton, there were some in Green River and Rock Springs, they got to stay. But on the other hand, in the West Coast, we had this General John DeWitt, Lieutenant General John DeWitt. It turns out he hated Japanese with a passion. In fact, he even hated partial Japanese. So he ordered all of these people with even a little bit of blood of Japanese into prisons. He even took out children with mixed parents from orphanages and put them into prison. And that was a condition that happened when we were told to get ready. And then we started seeing the local signs of hate. I remember a newspaper headline that said, ouster of, I quote, J word. We don't like to use that abbreviation for Japanese, but that's the truth. It was J word, and this ouster of the J word is near. And then all of a sudden, I saw this billboard a half a block from my house. Huge billboard that said, bye-bye, J-word. I mean, how would you like it if a billboard went up near your house, naming, maybe your group, your religious group, your affinity, whatever you're associated with? That'd be awful, but that's what happened in 1942, and that describes the condition that we had. So we had, a very short time to pack, about 2 weeks, told to get ready to move. We got on buses, the armed guards came. And then they took us to trains. We got on the trains, and the guards were shoulder to shoulder with rifles surrounding the train. It was a prison train, and I remember riding that train from San Francisco until we got to a place called Wyoming. Never set foot in Wyoming before. And every time, we were sitting on these hard benches for that time. I remember when we got to a certain place, we'd peek out the window because they told us, don't look beyond outside. The shades were pulled. But I remember going up through Wind River Canyon and the tunnels, and then clearly we set foot on Hart Mountain, Wyoming. The guards met us at the camp, and the guards then escorted us on backs of trucks, climbing on the backs of trucks like cattle and carrying our one suitcase. And I remember going through the main gate and assigned to our barrack, our block and our barrack. I was in block number 14, barrack number 22, and cell or room number C. It measured exactly 20 feet by 20 feet for our entire family, 4 of us. And we were in there for 3 years. There was no inner wall. There was no drywall. There was no insulation. Just the inside surface of the outside wall. There was no water. There was no electricity except for a single light bulb in the ceiling. We had to go to the bathroom, so what did they do? They built a toilet for men and a toilet for women. They had that decency, but within the toilet, there were 10 seats. And after breakfast, there'd be a line of people, maybe up to 300 people, and if you were lucky to get a seat, now you're faced with a new problem, because there are 9 faces looking at you while you're doing your business. There was no partitions. So you can imagine, that's the condition we had. We had a mess hall. The food was awful. We had, if you can imagine, potatoes. We had bread, and we had pickled vegetables. In the pitcher, there was powdered milk. I've sworn off powdered milk for 80 years. That's how much I hated it. But that's what they fed us. We had no choice. So after that, we had another problem, medical help. My father had a case of glaucoma before the camp. In fact, it started when he was in college. And he developed his glaucoma, but it was under the care of a specialist, an ophthalmologist specialist in San Francisco. And he was able to maintain my father's eyesight for all that time, almost 20 years, until he got to camp. At the camp, we had a medical staff consisting of all prisoners. They were general practitioners. Oh, they were good at delivering babies, and they were good at fixing broken bones, but there was no one who knew how to take care of glaucoma. So my father went blind in camp. General DeWitt would not let him go back to San Francisco to even see his doctor. So that was a major catastrophe for our family. We got back home, it was miserable because he lost his job and had to go live under those conditions. That wasn't the worst case. My grandfather died in camp, very short time. In 3 months, he was down to skin and bones. He looked awful, and he died. And we had a funeral inside a barrack. And I remember, he looked so bad. About a few years ago, I looked at his medical records, because all of us who went to the camp are allowed to look at medical records. They're in the National Archives today. And I found out my grandfather was terribly treated. He was given a diet of no food. I remember he kept asking for food, and then eventually they started giving him a laxative to keep his system clean, for cancer, of all things. And he passed away, miserable. But that wasn't the worst of all. The very worst condition I remember, the government let us into downtown Cody, a few at a time, to go shopping. And I remember looking up and down the Sheridan Avenue and looking at some of the stores. About a third of the stores, 30% of the stores, had signs. They didn't want us. Awful. After all those years, we didn't do anything to them, but they wanted to make sure we don't enter their stores. Now, I have to be careful. Not everybody. 2/3 of them were, in fact, several people, like the Simpsons, were very, very helpful, and they were very friendly, but not a few people, and that was the real problem. So that was my experience of racial hatred here in Wyoming, and that was something that really hurt. At the very end, there was an attorney, James Purcell in San Francisco, a white attorney. He figured out how to get us out of camp. And what he did was he filed a lawsuit on behalf of one lady, a person named Mitsuo Endo, a Japanese-American lady. It turns out she was a perfectly honorable, loyal citizen of the U.S. She did exactly what General DeWitt told her to do. Never been to Japan, never associated with other Japanese. In fact, she was a model citizen. And so Purcell filed this lawsuit. You cannot keep a person who is a loyal citizen in such a condition in a prison for such a long time, because that is unconstitutional. And guess what? The Supreme Court took it up 9-0, unanimous. Let her go, because it is unconstitutional, and you shouldn't do that. And the government decided then to let everyone go. That's how we got out. That's how the camps were closed. So we finally got home. Life was difficult. As I mentioned, Dad lost his job and so forth. And we're not the worst ones. The worst ones were people who lost homes, they lost jobs. It was very, very difficult for a lot of people. But I wanted to mention also that after a while, we finally wanted an apology from the government. It took a long time, 50 years of effort. And finally, we received an apology in the form of a bill that was passed, the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, along with a small check to help pay for the damages. And that went a long way. Now, we wanted to do something, though, that will be memorable, that people will remember, and so we built a school, a learning center here. And it's done miraculous. You'll hear a little bit more about that in a moment. But it was a very successful activity. We invested, and it's brought a lot of activity of people visiting, people learning. And I wanted to simply mention that when we opened that facility 10 years ago, I remember I walked up and down Main Street of Cody and looked in the windows just like I did back in 1942, 70 years after. And guess what? Every window had a sign. Welcome, Japanese Americans. My goodness, the people have changed. And so I thank the people of being more realistic. And people should remember, when you have that combination of hate and you have hysteria, and worst of all, some leaders who ignore the Constitution, when you have that combination, it had happened to us, it could happen again to other people. And so again, thank you very much for the opportunity to tell my short story. Thank you. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Sam. And the impression I got when you showed up in my office 10 years ago was that you were affected by that discrimination and what you experienced as a child at Hart Mountain in Cody, in the town of Cody. But I felt like after the grand opening of our museum, which is right behind us, this gorgeous museum that we have, it did change your view. It did change your view that you wanted to use your energy and your time to do great things. So I want to thank you for traveling around the country and sharing that with us. But can you just briefly, you knew my mother before, during, and after the war. I found a photograph that Sam shared with me and my aunt shared with me of Sam, you must have been like 6 years old or 7 years old. There's my mother. And this was all before going into Hart Mountain. And then you knew her afterwards. What are your memories of her?
Well, Setsuko was a very, very warm and generous person. I remember going, what I actually did was I went to her house because I wanted to meet and see her younger brother, Hiroshi, who was my age, and we were classmates in high school. And so Setsuko would always greet us and welcome us, and very concerned, very outgoing, and wondered, how are you doing? How's your family doing? How's your father doing? And I had this impression that she was a very warm and gracious person. I've wondered if, I don't have any sisters, but if I had a sister, I wish it were like Shirley, because that would be the perfect model sister. But then I went along. We started getting ready for college, and I found out that Setsuko's older brother, Fumio, and Hiroshi, the younger brother, both were accepted to college. Very expensive private college. Fumio went to MIT and Hiroshi went to Rensselaer. And I said, oh my gosh, the Saitos are very well-to-do. They can afford to send their two kids to a really expensive but very good school. So that was my impression for a long time. But I did not know until I read Setsukos Secret book that it was not that easy. In fact, there came a point where in order to pay for the tuition and the college expenses, Setsuko had to work as a common worker and in order to help pay for the expenses of college for her brothers. And I said, my gosh, that's reality. They're no different than a lot of us who have difficulties, and that's what the book told me. And I was very, very satisfied to know that the Saitos were a normal family, and they had their problems, and glad to see that Setsuko did help the rest of the family the way she did. So again, thanks for the book, Shirley.
Thank you.
That was good.
Well, it's great that I've met you now, and you knew my mother, and I can learn more about my mother through you. So thank you for that, and thank you for sharing. I'd like to bring to the stage Doug Nelson and Dakota Fleming, who are going to join us for a discussion. And Doug, as I mentioned earlier, is vice chair of the Hart Mountain Wyoming Foundation and a leader in the philanthropy and the foundation community. And Dakota Russell, our executive director, will sit next to Pete and join the conversation. But for Doug, in chapter 13 of my book, we talk about his initial exposure to Hart Mountain. And he also wrote a book that was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. And I want to get a sense from Doug, why did you write about this? And what kind of difficulties did you encounter?
Well, I was just a kid, graduated from the University of Illinois, and wanted to go to graduate school. And I was ready to go to the University of Chicago because I wanted to study the history of American philosophy. It's a tedious subject, but at that moment I thought it was what I should do. And because my new wife was very interested in cowboys and had this daydream about what it was like in Wyoming, which neither of us had ever been to, I applied there, and the chairman of the history department there said, yes, please come and we'll allow you to be part of the faculty and be an instructor for freshmen. Well, I'd never been so overestimated in my entire life as was evident in that letter. So I said, these people must love me. Let's go see what these cowboys do. And when I came, I realized that I needed to write a thesis, and I knew nothing about the cultivation of wheat or the cattle wars or most everything that was central to Western history. And one of my professors said, there's a relocation camp in northern Wyoming. you might want to look into that. And my first reaction was, I had heard about it. I said, oh, that must be, people must have written all about that. That's 25 years ago, and that was a major event. But I discovered soon, and this is all quite accurate, if you looked at 25 years after the war, tried to learn something about Hart Mountain, you would have found 2 full paragraphs in T.A. Larson's History of Wyoming that described it. There was not another thing written, and I should mention at the time in 1970 when I finished that thesis, there was also nothing at the camp except that chimney that was once described to me by a local Park County person as the remnant of an old mine. So what that place had been 25 years later was erased. I spent 6-8 months trying to learn as much as I could. The records were thorough. The newspaper that was published at the camp was very instructive. But I was opening boxes that had not been opened in archives in California and had not been opened since the war, since they were delivered, dropped off. That is how deeply buried this story was. And it was buried in the Japanese American community in the way that Shirley's book describes. People did not talk to their children about it for lots of reasons, including wanting to protect their children from the fearsome feelings that may be engendered by finding out what an awful time their parents had to endure. But I also tried to get memories from Wyoming folks that lived around that camp, and I didn't have the good sense to find any of the Simpsons, but I did find a lot of people who said, that's not our fault. You know, the defense, there's nothing to say. That's a long time ago, and I couldn't get a conversation out of anybody in 1970 about that camp. So that's why I jumped on this, and what I experienced, the book I wrote was the first comprehensive history of any of the camps. This is a quarter of a century after this enormous event. And Shirley mentioned I got a Pulitzer Prize. I got a Pulitzer Prize nomination not because it was a great book, but because even in the academic circles, no one knew about this. So there was a novelty to this subject that got me credit way beyond what the book merits. But that's how much a secret this was in families and in the country.
That's terrific, Doug. And I'm going to ask if we could pull, there we go. We pulled up the slide on the Minetta Simpson Institute. And, you know, Doug, you've accomplished so much in your career, leading these foundations like NEKC, the CDC Foundation, Carter Center, et cetera. Can you tell us the importance of our museum today and why going in the direction of Minetta Simpson Institute is so important for the public?
It's very, very important to me. It's probably the most important affiliation that I've had in my life. And this began in 1970 when my wife and I left Wyoming. We made one last stop up in Park County, drove up from Laramie. And by this time, my life had been changed by finding out this story. And I was moved by the story. I was matured by the story. My attitude toward life was impacted by that story. And in that emotion, when we stopped there and looked at the fact that there wasn't a single marker of what had happened there. And I remember saying to Linda, while we were standing there, I said, someday I'm going to find somebody important, somebody who can do something about creating something here that will tell people what actually happened to 10,000, 14,000 people during World War II. And that was in the back of my mind. But of course, I walked away knowing I was not important. and hoping something would happen, and went on with my life, and was lucky enough to get a job at the Annie Casey Foundation, and it was the most privileged job in the world. And I get a phone call from a couple of folks in Wyoming who knew about my book and tracked me down and said, would you be willing to help us figure out a way to get some land and to create a museum, or at least create a historical marker here? And I jumped at the chance because I remembered feeling that vacancy in what had been this enormous event. And Pete said something nice. I gave lots of money away at the Casey Foundation to thousands of nonprofits, and I've sat on nonprofit boards. There is no group of people that are more inspiringly committed to telling an honest and instructive story about what happened to them, mostly Japanese Americans, who sit on this board. So every time I participate in moving this thing forward, I have a sense that I am among some of the most important people I have ever met in my life. So that's how I got to here. And it's what I think makes the Mineta-Simpson initiative that we're about to embark on important. Now, I don't know whether you want me to talk about why I think that's so important, but I'll be glad to.
Well, go ahead. I think we have another minute, but I was also going to hopefully get you to talk a little bit. We have a museum there already, and it's a huge exhibit and other things that are there, a gift shop. What have our supporters gotten out of the museum to date? And then this is a whole new venture that's completely different in many ways.
Well, how many of you have had a chance to go over there and see the museum? It was none of my doing, but the people who decided what to put in that museum did an inspired job, and the museum has accomplished two things. The New York Times, this crazy little museum out in the middle of nowhere, excuse any pejorative implications of that, was described by the New York Times as one of the most powerful museums of conscience that existed in the United States. And it deserves that praise. And the reason it deserves that praise is because in the voices of Japanese Americans, it tells a story that has moved. About 100,000 people in the last 10 years have gone through that museum, more than 100,000. And almost everyone comes out with a degree of change, new knowledge, a new perspective on life and on what it means, what the Constitution means, what equality means, and what the implications of racism and fear mean. It is a very moving institution. But what that place does is now accessible to maybe 20 or 30,000 people a year. And in our minds, this is a story that ought to be moving and illuminating our history for not 30,000, but hundreds of thousands of people. How do we make this story accessible? And the Mineta-Simpson Institute is our effort to answer that question. What we're trying to create there is a center where we can bring teachers and public leaders to come together to not talk just about Hart Mountain, but think about the implications of real democracy and of real commitment to the rule of law and a real recognition of how volatile and flammable is this combination of fear and stereotypes and racial prejudice. And in these times, it seems even more critical that people get warned about the huge mistake that fear and racism created 75 years ago. And so we wanted to figure out, how can we train people? How can we make this place a larger center of learning? And how can we take, which COVID has helped teach us, how can we make this story accessible virtually? And how can we use podcasts, documentaries, publications? This conversation here is being live streamed to an increasingly large audience of people who care about Hart Mountain and the Japanese American experience. We wanted to get the capacity there to do that larger educational agenda, and we wanted it to be shaped by the values that have made Norman Mineta and Alan Simpson inspiring models of leaders for all of us. Those two men crossed political differences, background differences, racial differences, and found what they had in common was an immense love for what is exceptional and good and right about this country. And we would like this story to inspire other people, regardless of their backgrounds, to appreciate their responsibility to protect what is good and noble and right and exceptional about this country, and never let this kind of lapse happen to anybody again. And so to honor their example, and then to use that spirit to try to create an opportunity for lots more people to learn, both by coming to the place, but by hearing this story in all the different media that we have available today. That's what we want to do. And we've raised about $2 million before we've even started the real fundraising. Of the $4.5 million, I think it's going to cost us to do this to do this initiative right, and to create the facility that we think we can and should create. So one of the messages here tonight for all of the extremely wealthy people in the building is that after you give an appropriate donation to the Center for the Arts, as Marty was requesting, keep in mind a second opportunity to support, help us get the Mineta Simpson Institute done. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Doug. Thanks for that. And I got to quickly turn to our executive director, who's doing a fabulous job, boots on the ground. Can you describe the design of our current museum and the Mineta Simpson Institute designs that you're actually working on right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you folks were looking at before, our museum, and I'm glad to see so many hands when Doug asked how many had been to it. That's fantastic. But all of those of you who have been to it know that the museum is designed to look like 3 of the camp barracks in a row there. And so when we thought about adding on to this space, and we thought about adding this Mineta Simpson Institute, a place for people to gather, a place for conversation, for communication, for building relationships, we wanted to keep with that motif and expand on it. And so we looked through the camp architecture, and at first we considered, okay, can we look at another barrack, but we came to the realization that, barracks, not that there was much privacy at all within the camp, but they were spaces where a lot of people didn't interact, but where they did interact in a big way was in the camp's mess halls. So every block of the camp had 2 mess halls on it, and the mess halls, each of these mess halls was shared by about 250 people. And so these were places to meet and congregate during the meal times, of course, but the incarcerees also put them to greater use. On Saturday nights, even in the dead of winter, people would move the tables from half of the mess hall, and they would set up a makeshift stage in the corner, and they would run talent shows inside of these mess halls. Groups like the Fair Play Committee, which led the draft resistance movement at Hart Mountain, first began meeting within the mess halls and formulating, what were their demands from the government before they would serve in the armed forces. And so these were the places where people came together and where ideas were formed within the camp. And so we realized that a mess hall was what we needed the Minetta Simpson Institute to be. And so as you can see in the picture here, what we have realized from that is that coming off of these 3 barracks, you'll now have this hall that leads out, which will be an exhibit honoring the lives and careers of Norm Minetta and Alan Simpson. And then it will open up into this mess hall structure where you'll have a large meeting space, where you'll have the digital production studio that will allow us to take our programs that we offer there and bring them out to a much, much larger audience. Where you'll still have, through the use of the windows that transect the mess hall there, great views of Hart Mountain, and so people can be rooted in the place as we are holding these meetings here. And it's going to bring all of these features and really create something that is in the spirit of the place and also in the spirit of what we hope to accomplish with this new wing.
That's great, Dakota. I love the way you describe everything. I have to talk about the root cellar that you have been overseeing the restoration of. And you've received federal funding for that and individual donations to complete that project. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so that's been an amazing project. Those of you who have been out recently have probably seen that we are growing beyond the 4 walls of the museum already at Hart Mountain and becoming more of a real historic site there. And a big part of that is the restoration of an original barrack that we moved back from Shell, Wyoming, back to Hart Mountain, and also the restoration of this camp root cellar. Which is an amazing structure. First, just architecturally amazing. You got to remember, when you and me think of a root cellar, we think of a tiny little cramped room underground, right? Where things are stored, where maybe you run down into in a storm there. This is a cellar that was designed to store food for 11,000 people, right? So this structure is an underground structure, but it's over 300 feet long underground. It is absolutely massive, made so you could drive a truck into one end and drive it out of the other end. The most impressive part of this, though, is that it is the only structure remaining that was entirely designed and built by the Japanese American incarcerees. In fact, they took over a sawmill in the Shoshone National Forest so they could harvest the timbers and haul them back to camp. And so it really remains the biggest piece of the camp that their fingerprints are all over. And that makes it so special and unique to us that we knew that once we acquired it, that we had to take the extraordinary lengths that it took to preserve it. And those links are extraordinary. Because of it being underground, it has pressures coming on it from all directions. Because of its size, it's a $1.2 million project. And so we set out with a huge goal for being able to stabilize and restore this structure. But we have been able to put together a quilt work of federal funds through the National Park Service. A private foundation has stepped in to help out with that as well. And as of this year, we were able to pull together all the funds that we need to fully restore that root cellar. And so work on it's going to begin in earnest, hopefully starting a bit this fall, but on into the spring. We're hoping by the end of the summer, into the fall, when you come back to Hart Mountain, that you'll be able to fully go down and tour that structure. You know, I say this, and I think this is why Shirley asked me about it, is that, as Doug says, a little museum out in the middle of nowhere, Wyoming. It seems impossible sometimes that we can do big things, but this story is so important to so many people, and that doesn't just go for our big donors, but we are a foundation that operates off of grassroots funds in a big way. You know, those $50 donations, $100 donations, $250 donations add up, and it's so heartening to see that so many people believe in what we're doing here and believe in the cause, that we can make these big things happen that might look impossible to other folks.
That's great, Dakota. Well, I'm going to open it up for questions. I probably should have warned the audience that if you're interested in asking anyone up here any questions, we're able to do that. So feel free to ask away. But in the meantime, oh, do I see a hand up out there? Oh, somebody was just putting their arm around somebody. Okay. Oh, we have a question down here.
Thank you for doing this. I appreciate it. So I know for a while Wyoming had some alien laws, especially coming out of World War II. Were there any families from Hart Mountain that wanted to stay in Wyoming that weren't able to? Or were there families that were able to stay in Wyoming? Are they still here?
Well, I know there are. Doug, do you want to take that question?
Well, I'll take a part of it, but I think Dakota.
The question, please.
The question was, did any of the internees remain in Wyoming after they were released from camp? And I can tell you a few did. A few did, but the legislature during the Wyoming legislature during the period of incarceration developed some legislation of questionable constitutionality that denied persons brought to the state by the War Relocation Authority, that was the language used in the legislation, were prohibited from qualifying for hunting license, fishing license, voting, a whole list of things you associate with being a citizen of a state. So there was no welcome sign being shown to folks, there were more Japanese Americans living in Wyoming in the 1940 census than were living here in the 1950 census. So there was a period of time in which this was not a particularly attractive place for Japanese Americans to set down their roots. But you know an exception or two, and you should talk about it, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. So the big exceptions to the rule are the people who wound up marrying into the Japanese American families that already were in Wyoming. This is something that not a lot of people realize is much like other Western states, Japanese Americans had been in Wyoming since the early 1900s. They had been working primarily as miners and on the railroad. By this point, a lot of them had settled and gone into farming and ranching. And so there was a lot of interaction between this community that already existed here, which, because they were east of that imaginary line that the government drew in 1942, were able to stay on their farms and in their homes and did not have to go to camp. As you can imagine, it was a shock to most of them to realize that right next door, thousands of people were being incarcerated because they were Japanese Americans while they were largely being left alone. But they interacted with the camp quite a bit, and in fact, several people met and married their spouses from people from the camp, and those families wound up staying. There was a fellow by the name of Shuichi Ujifusa down in Worland, Wyoming, who also had this dream of establishing a Japanese-American utopia down there, and worked very actively to try and convince folks to settle down in Worland after the war, and was successful in recruiting about half a dozen families to stay in Worland after the war, which went to prove just how unenforceable most of those laws were. When push came to shove, the legislature did not try and prosecute any of it. They chose just to ignore those few that settled. But Doug is absolutely right. Most people were largely discouraged and realized that they were not wanted here, got the message, and went elsewhere. That's contrasted with the camp in Colorado, where they were openly welcomed to resettle within the communities there. And so Colorado actually had a larger Japanese American community after the war than during it.
I think there's a question in the back.
I have visited Manzanar as well as Hart Mountain. Are there other camps that are being kept alive through museums and
Right. Well, there's one called Topaz Museum that's in Utah. And I don't know, Dakota, are there any other memorials? I think each side has something.
Sure, absolutely.
Minidoka.
There's been a lot going on. to sort of build organizations up. National Park Service has taken a larger role in it. So they've got Minidoka in Idaho now, as well as Manzanar and Tule Lake in California that they're working on preserving. Topaz in Utah is an organization just like us that was started by former incarcerees like Sam, who really started to realize after the redress period that it was time to make a lasting impression on the landscape. So that's pretty fantastic. And then you're seeing amongst the other sites there in Colorado, in Arkansas even, and in Arizona to some degree, although those are harder because those are both on reservation land down there. But you're starting to see groups form around them and work to preserve them. One of the things that Hart Mountain's really been a leader in is in getting all of those folks to work together. We've created the Japanese American Confinement Sites Consortium, which is really a national movement to get us out of our silos and start seeing this as a comprehensive project and working on it together. And so that's made a lot of headway in getting some of these other sites preserved and their stories told.
And that's part of the complexity, because there was a lot of splitting amongst the Japanese American communities, and we were encouraged not to cooperate. So now that we're all coming together is a really great thing. Is there a question up here?
Yes. I would direct my question to Sam, since he was in the camp.
Mm-hmm.
Did any of the detainees ever try to organize an attempt to escape the camp?
Interesting question. Did any of the internees try to escape or organize an effort? There was never an escape from Hart Mountain. By escape, you mean somebody actually leaving and trying to run away and permanently find another place. The answer is no. However, there were some people like myself who wanted to escape. And I remember when the guards were not looking or they're falling asleep, and by the way, that was quite common after a long time in a guard tower, we would escape and spread apart the barbed wire and run down to the river and go looking for arrowheads, because that used to be, Crow Indian country, collect rattlesnakes and scorpions and all kinds of crazy things. But we always came back, never went in permanent. So to answer your question, no one ever really escaped, or tried to escape.
We're going to have to move along, and I apologize for others that have questions. I want to really mention a special award that we have for Pete Simpson before we leave. And this is the LaDonna Zoll Compassionate Witness Award. And it's after a woman named LaDonna Zoll, who recently passed away, who dedicated many, many hours as our first curator and volunteer to really help build our foundation and museum. And we have a debt of gratitude. A very humble person. And this Compassionate Witness Award was established several years ago. And this year we presented it to Pete Simpson. And I just want to read a passage, and then I want to give this plaque to Peter. Peter K. Simpson, since 1942, has been tied to Hart Mountain through his youthful visit as a Boy Scout to have a jamboree with incarcerated Japanese Americans, and his enduring commitment to preserving the memory of what happened on this ground during World War II. As a historian and legislator, Peter Simpson has exemplified the value of education in bipartisan collaboration. At the University of Wyoming, he made multiple contributions as its vice president of development and executive director of the UW Foundation. He inspired scholars and community leaders throughout the state with his wisdom and kindness. Peter Simpson's dedication to education and collaboration made him one of the vital community leaders in Northwest Wyoming, behind the creation of the Hart Mountain Wyoming Foundation. And we thank you so very, very much, Pete.
Well, it's deeply moving. Very, very gratifying.
You don't have to get up.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. That's really cool. That's a beautiful and moving thing, and I really appreciate it. Dad used to say, I don't deserve it. That's why I enjoy it so much. So I deeply appreciate it. That's your great honor.
Pete.
Thank you.
And then we also have a raffle of a double-signed copy that actually Secretary Norman Mineta signed, as well as Senator Alan Simpson and myself. So I have to announce that winner is Mr. Childs Cusack. Is he still? Oh, you won! You're the winner. So we have a double-signed copy of that for you, and I'm
Right
sure it's.
underneath your chair, Shirley.
Oh, and I'm supposed to crouch under here.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
So anyways, if you want to come up and grab the book, Dakota can hand that to you. But I want to have Doug Nelson. Do you have any parting words for us as we close up this evening? This has been a fabulous program, so thanks everyone for coming.
Yeah, of course. It's wonderful, and the reception that we have gotten here in Jackson last night at the American Legion and tonight here is really, really reassuring and much appreciated. I would say I had two thoughts that came out of this conversation. One is if Luke Sakata was the funniest person that Pete Simpson ever met, what is Alan Simpson? I'm going to... Anyway, we really would like to make the cautionary tale and the story of resilience and the story of redemption that is buried in what happened at Hart Mountain an influence, a positive influence on the future of this country. And we hope the Mineta-Simpson Institute will help us do that. And so it is no fun. It is no fun. I, for most of my life, was given the opportunity to give away somebody else's money. And I'm being punished by the gods to spend the latter part of my life begging for money from others, and I certainly deserve that. But I think that this is a cause that is worthy. I think it is something that Wyoming can be proud of, and I think for those of you who also feel as strongly as we do that such a thing should never happen again, please find folks who will share that view. Help us make this outreach institution and this effort to honor Alan Simpson and Norman Mineta a reality, and help us in a hurry, because we want Alan and Norm to see this structure and to cut the ribbon at its opening, and we believe that we ought to get this done in a couple years, and that will take a lot of help from our friends. So please give that some consideration, and thanks for being interested.
Thank you very much. And I'll be outside signing books if you're interested for about 50 minutes, and thanks to Marty and his wonderful staff. So let's give them a round of applause.